Tank fucking Abbott. Tell me, what comes to mind when you hear that name? Is it that shit-eating grin he used to have? That hillbilly Colgate smile with half of his front teeth missing? Or maybe that iconic KO where he folded that dude like a sweater, leaving him lying there like a new age yoga instructor who just went too far. Well, if none of those images come to mind, you're in for a real treat. So get ready to meet an outstanding member of society, someone you'd want your daughter to date. A refined gentleman. Oh, fuck it. Let's check this dude out. When you see Tank for the first time, he conjures up a lot of images and feelings that might be disturbing to normal people. But people like us revel in such things. For me, the first time I saw Tank, I immediately got flashbacks to that movie Deliverance. More specifically, that scene where they wanted that guy to squeal like a pig while they had their way with him. That haunting number that inbred kid played on that banjo. You see, Tank had that backwoods, you got purty teeth aura about him. That I don't even know how to read aura about him. The man had a beer gut that would make anyone in the trailer park envious, especially Phil Collins. Now, with all those assumptions, you'd be surprised to know that Tank actually has a degree in history. The man has written a book, for fuck's sakes. He's been on television shows. At first, I thought Tank was just a hillbilly with heavy hands, but was surprised when hearing his accolades. Tank was actually an NCAA All-American in university. He trained boxing under legend Noe Cruz, who trained champion Carlos Palomino. In those early days, Tank developed his brawling style in bars in Huntington Beach, supposedly knocking the teeth out of everyone, who looked at him funny, that is. In one instance, Tank supposedly KO'd 4 guys at the same time, as well as being able to bench 300 kilos or 600 pounds, depending on where you live in the world. Rumors started circulating that Tank had over 200 street fights, most of whom he'd won, a number that would even make Charlie Zelenoff, the GOAT, envious. It was not all sunshine and rainbows though for Tank. One time while working at a liquor store, he got into it with this customer and apparently beat the living snot out of him. He had to spend 6 months in the can for that little incident. It was around this time that Tank finally entered the UFC, having done a good job cultivating his tough guy persona. Back in those days though, the UFC was, how to put it, not as refined as it is today. It literally was no holds barred. Headbutts, groin strikes, fish hooking, all valid routes to victory. You could even kick motherfuckers in the face wearing shoes. The only rules, if you could call them that, were no biting and no hair pulling. But who needs to bite someone when you can just kick him in the balls, right? The UFC also operated in somewhat of a different format back then, with tournaments where fighters would fight up to 3 times in the same night, something that I personally really miss. Tank's debut was at UFC 6, where he faced 3 men in the same night. In the first tournament he would take part in, John Matua would be Tank's first victim, being the lucky recipient of a brutal KO in only 18 seconds. And while Matua's lifeless body was convulsing on the floor, Tank did what any mature grown-up would do. He made fun of him, further solidifying his bad boy image, I guess. I guess people weren't as sensitive back then as they are today. I mean, you could mock a person when he was convulsing violently on the floor, but I don't know. Tank's second victim that night, though, was Paul Varlan's. 140 kilo, 2 meter, or 300 pounds, 6'8", again, depending on where you live in the world, wrestler with his iconic flat top haircut, who is possibly best known for being absolutely just annihilated by much smaller fighting legend Igor Vovchanchyn. If you don't know who Igor is, please go look him up. He's awesome. And after the Varlan's TKO, Tank claimed that he got sexually aroused during the fight. Whatever floats your boat, I guess. We don't judge here. Anyway, the third and final fight of the night for Tank was against fighter turned actor Oleg Taktarov, who you might remember from such movies as 15 Minutes, Bad Boys 2, and Predators. In a grueling 17-minute fight where Oleg managed to survive Tank's initial onslaught, finally ending up locking in the rear naked choke, thus eliminating him from the tournament, Big John McCarthy praised Tank after the fight, saying that he thought Tank would be the next big star in the UFC. Tank's next tournament was at Ultimate 95, gotta love those names, where he actually defeated his first opponent via neck crank, showing everyone he was capable of submissions, I guess. He then moved on to face legend Dan Severn, losing by unanimous decision because Dan Severn was a fucking badass. Tank would return at UFC 2 to yet another tournament where he would gain his second and final career submission via forearm choke, but ended up losing to Scott Big Fucking Gut Ferozzo via unanimous decision. You see, Ferozzo became Tank's arch enemy from that point on. Some said it was because Ferozzo had a mightier beer gut than Tank, thus giving Tank beer gut envy. Others claimed Ferozzo was the original tough guy, not Tank. Whatever the reason, their fates or guts were intertwined from that point on, ensuring another meeting down the road. Ultimate 96 would be the last tournament Tank would take part in, as the UFC wanted to move away from the tournament format and transition into the events as we know them today. At this point, though, the competition was just getting better. Fighters were slowly starting to evolve, accumulating more weapons in their arsenals. The days of just being good at one aspect of fighting would soon be coming to an end. You would either have to evolve with the sport or just simply get left behind. At this point, Tank could still rely on his brawling and would defeat his first two opponents of the night. It was here that Tank brutally KO'd a poor man named Steve Nelmark. You probably never heard his name before because he just kind of disappeared after this KO. But that was an infamous clip that made Tank synonymous with cage fighting. I remember seeing that KO when I was younger and instantly thinking, god damn, that man is dead. And seeing Tank standing over his lifeless body, yelling profanities, just made it all the more disturbing to me. Tank later remarked that if that fight had happened in the streets, he would have kicked him in the head multiple times, even after knocking him out. Which, I mean, just goes to show how much of a stand-up guy Tank was back then. Tank would ultimately end up losing to Don Fry and his infamous Tom Selleck mustache via rear naked choke, thus eliminating him from the last tournament he would take part in. Fry would later remark that the punches he had received from Tank were the hardest he had ever been hit in any fight. The Fry loss would be the beginning of the end for Tank, unfortunately, losing his next 2 fights via TKO against Vitor Belfort, where Belfort just absolutely destroyed Tank with his TRT superior hand speed and boxing, and the other loss to Maurice Smith, in which would be the first of 2 title fights Tank would partake in. Tank would later say that he literally fell off the bar stool into the octagon, as he was a replacement for Dan Severn. Tank would win his next 2 fights, but then suffered his first KO by the hands of top contender at the time, Pedro Hizzo. That KO would obviously have a massive effect on Tank because he would retire from MMA shortly after that. Although Tank would applaud Hizzo for his toughness, he also claimed that Hizzo's team had cheated by greasing the canvas of the octagon. Come on, dude. Of course, this was just Tank's bruised ego talking, trying to justify why he lost. Tank's hiatus would last almost 5 years, but it might as well have been 20. The level of skill required to enter the UFC had increased drastically. Gone were the days where a fighter could just be exceptional in one aspect of fighting. The evolution had begun. Unfortunately for Tank, the sport had moved on, but he had stayed the same. A throwback to the early days of the UFC, a dinosaur, hopelessly out of date, like using a fax machine in an age of emails. Tank, however, would get a warm welcome in his return to the UFC by none other than 2-time heavyweight champion Frank Mir, losing via toe hold, showing just how horribly far behind Tank was. Tank would continue his losing streak all the way up to UFC 45, where he lost yet again to Cabbage via TKO, doctor stoppage, because of a cut. Although the fight had been somewhat competitive, I guess, it had become glaringly obvious that Tank was way out of his element at this point. This would be the last fight Tank would have in the UFC. Tank would KO Cabbage in their rematch at Rumble on the Rocks 7 more than a year later. This was his first win since his return to MMA in 2003. From here, Tank would go on a 4-fight skid, suffering 1 TKO and 2 knockouts, one of which was delivered by street fighting superstar Kimbo Slice. Tank's final victory, though, would be over Mike Bork, if I'm saying that correctly, scoring a KO in only 29 seconds into the fight. And just as a star dies and implodes in on itself, a final moment of greatness can be seen. At age 44, Tank would yet again show the world that power really is the last thing to go. Tank would lose his second title fight before retiring at the ripe old age of 48. And it's also worth mentioning that Tank faced his archenemy Scott Ferozzo in an unsanctioned backyard brawl in 2011, winning via unanimous decision, thus ending the age-old question of who really had the bigger fucking gut, or who was the original tough guy, I guess. But in 2018, Tank's lifestyle of boozing and, well, other stuff, I guess, finally caught up with him. His liver, unfortunately, was damaged beyond all repair and needed a transplant. Tank suffered several strokes while being operated on, but managed to pull through, refusing to give up like he had done in all those cage fights and bar brawls. So, what was the legacy that Tank left behind? What did Tank do for the UFC? Or MMA for that matter? To me, Tank was a crucial building block for the sport. His brutality combined with his total disrespect for his opponents made the whole thing a spectacle, thus garnering more attention for the sport, more eyes to see the freak show. It was crucial in those early days of the UFC. Admittedly, there was a lot of negativity that accompanied this attention as well, but it was a necessary evil in my opinion. People came to see raw violence, not some watered down choreographed dance. And Tank would give them just that. Raw, unadulterated. He looked like a man that had taken a break from cooking up moonshine in a shack deep in the woods, only to come to civilization to smash up some city folk. His skill set was basic, relying heavily on striking, and he was not a specimen like a Francis Ngannou, but he still managed to carve out his place in the sport. He not only gave us interesting fights, but also handed down the blueprint to coming generations of how to deal with a heavy-hitting brawler like himself by exposing his weaknesses, helping the sport make that evolutionary leap. And even though he retired way too late, he still retained that will to fight, even when it was to his detriment. You see, Tank was born about 1,000 years too late. He missed his true calling as a bloodthirsty barbarian raiding and pillaging some unsuspecting village and then drinking until he passes out in a pile of his own puke.